everyone. This is Deaconess Dehlia, and this is a post-sermon podcast. I am with Vicar James, and today we are having a special episode where we will be discussing a little bit his sermons, but just his whole past year with his vicarage at St. John and the development of his preaching. How are you doing today, Vicar?
I'm doing okay.
Man, I can't believe are you done yet? I guess technically not.
No, I'm still employed here for another 3 days, I think. 3 days.
Yeah, and how does this feel for this being, well, I guess this is going to be your second to last episode.
Yeah, second one. We're doing one more right after this one.
Wow, yeah, it's incredible to think it's been a whole year. And I know I wanted to do this episode to just really give you a chance to talk about the sermon process, what you've learned this past year. You're not a pastor yet, but you were able to, for this past year, really work on your skills and find out what it's like to really work on the art of preaching. So let's start with your growth in this past year. Tell us what you learned about preaching.
It's hard.
It's hard.
It is challenging at times. It's funny because it's different. Each sermon is different and completely different animal every time you approach it. There's a process to doing it, and I think that what I developed most over this last year was just kind of locking down that process and working through it, making mistakes and figuring out how to overcome those mistakes, and just being able to be more comfortable in the sermon writing process. And so I think that's what I worked on the most, is just getting that locked in and being able to work through the whole thing.
So you mentioned making mistakes. Do you mind just elaborating? Like what were some of the mistakes or like trials and errors you had with preaching?
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge that I had over the last year was sharpening the problem, I guess is the way to say it. It's whenever you look at a text, you have to figure out what the problem in the text is and why does that matter to the congregation. You can preach something that's true, but it may not really make a whole lot of difference to the people who are listening. And so I think that was the biggest struggle I had. And I think it's probably a problem that most vicars are going to have anyway, just because they're not all that familiar with the congregation, and they're also new to preaching in general. And so we tend to caution on the side of generalities, right? For an example, in the sermon that I did 2 weeks ago, not this last Sunday, but the Sunday before that, ladders to nowhere, and I started out talking about how different religions, climbed the ladder to God, and used works righteousness to get up to God. I could have left it at that, and that would have most certainly been true. And we could have just been like, well, that's them, and this is us. They're bad, we're good, everything's okay. But that wouldn't have been a particularly helpful sermon for people. Instead, that was just an example of how other people do it, and then I turned to how we tend to try to climb that ladder as well, the different things that we do. And so, I kind of started far away and moved closer to sharpen the problem, why it is that we need to focus on this, and how Jesus is the solution to that problem, how we focus on Christ. And so I think that was the biggest challenge that I faced over the last year. I remember several times, writing a sermon and then just like stressing because I'm going to deliver this sermon, even one time the next day, and I hadn't had it written yet, let alone memorized. And so
must have been a long day.
It was a long day. So I think I left. This was a Wednesday service. I left Tuesday night. Finally had it written. And then I spent all the next day memorizing the sermon so that I could preach it at 12. So that was a struggle, but I think it was good though, because you learn how to deal with those situations, and you learn to better sharpen the problem so you don't have that problem again.
Sure. So you mentioned better sharpening the problem, and you did that through preaching to this particular congregation here at St. John, correct? Mm-hmm. So what was it like preaching to the people at St. John?
Oh, well, it's really good. I think that like I said, every vicar is going to have the same challenge because they don't know the congregation that well. So expect the next vicar to be very general. Hopefully he's not, but we just don't know the congregation as well. But it was really good preaching. The congregation is very welcoming and very forgiving as well. I remember, there was a couple of times where I forgot what I was going to say, and even one time it was like I can't remember the exact phrase, but it was something like, and sometimes, and then I lost it. And then I said, and sometimes you just forget what you're going to say. And so I turned around and walked up to the pulpit and looked at my notes and then continued on. But
was that the time you like sighed when you couldn't remember?
I think that was the second time I did that.
Second time.
Yeah, the first time I just said, and sometimes you just forget what you're going to say.
Yeah,
and I
think
a good
line.
Yeah. So, but yeah, they're very forgiving. I think they laughed at me, or not laughed at me, but laughed, and it was fine. So yeah, so it's been really a joy to preach here. It's been a blessing. The congregation is so welcoming. And, not really so much to do with preaching, but, ever since I got here, I never felt like we were outside of the congregation or outside of the church. We were welcomed in right away. I never felt like, oh, this is the vicar. He's only going to be here for a year.
Just let him do his thing. Let's not really welcome him with open arms.
Yeah. So I think it's been a real pleasure to preach here, and I've said this several times, but I really am grateful to them for them letting me practice on them. So
yeah. So you had to work with Pastor Adam quite a bit throughout the year, and I'm assuming, especially at the beginning, maybe being with him extra time, just going over your sermons and whatnot. So what was that like, just working with Pastor on your sermon?
Yeah, it was really good. He's the only pastor supervisor I've ever had, so basing it on that.
A little biased with that.
Yeah. So, but no, I really, it was challenging not to work with him, but he challenged me to make sure my sermons were better. It wasn't an easy thing to do, but he's really good at the sermon process, and so he really opened my eyes up to how to write the sermon well. And again, the sharpening the problem, he would always come back to that, sharpening the problem and making it easier. It makes the solution of the problem more comforting and more concise. And so he's really good at the process, and he's really good at conveying that process. I think he helped me out. He helped me polish a lot of my sermons. And I think this is just a really good practice anyway. It's a lot easier when to deliver a better sermon when you get feedback from people, because things you take for granted, like, should I say this quote, or do I have to explain this quote? Will people know what this quote means, right? Do I have to go into a lot of different context, because they may or may not know the background behind this? Like this weekend sermon on Elijah, when I was working through that text, I was thinking, well, in order for this to work, people have to know the story of Elijah. So I had to go back. I had to make the conscious decision to go back several chapters and sort of explain the story of Elijah. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense what we were even talking about. Why is Elijah upset in this cave on Mount Horeb, right? So anyway, I think it's been really good working with Pastor Adam. It's definitely improved my sermons. I know a lot of people say, I really like this sermon or that sermon, and I always try to give credit to Pastor Adam because he has helped out quite a bit. He's actually made some suggestions that really did significantly change how the sermon worked.
Now, did you ever have to rewrite any of them?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there was, that one I was telling you about, that was the night before on the Wednesday. That one I had written already, and then I trashed the whole thing and restarted. The one with the national tragedy, that one wasn't, I didn't rewrite it. I just ditched what I was working on and
went in a completely different
direction. So yeah, those are the only two times I think I actually had to start from scratch. But I did make some big modifications to some of them throughout the year.
And something else I know in your sermons, like there are different sermon structures that you worked on as well, right?
Yeah.
Do you have a particular one that you gravitated towards?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, and it's
Story.
no. Believe it or not, it's called problem solution.
Oh, okay.
It's a really easy sermon structure. It's just what's the problem, what's the solution to the problem. I tend to gravitate towards that one. It's funny, Pastor Adam. I was trying to do different sermon structures, and when I wrote the sermon for the National Day of Tragedy, I actually started out with the problem solution, but then I decided at the end to incorporate the image, and because of the nature of that sermon, Pastor Adam and I went over that sermon, and he commented at the beginning because I put the structure at the top, and it said problem solution. He's like, "Oh, your favorite structure again, right?" And then he starts to read through it, and at the bottom I had the image. He goes, "Oh, hey, you did image delayed," and I said, "Hey, look at that! I did a different structure."
So that's not what you started out with.
No, it's not what I started with, but hey, I got one more under my belt.
Yeah, exactly. Is there one in particular or one structure in particular that you really didn't like, or maybe it was just a big challenge for you?
I don't know if there's one that I didn't like. There were some that I wanted to use but didn't really. So yeah, it was hard to put it. It was hard to structure it. Some texts or sermons just fit better in different structures. So I default to two structures: the problem solution structure and the 4-page structure. This weekend's sermon was a 4-page structure. So I kind of default to those two. I tried to do I wanted to do a comparison structure, but the few times that I looked at it, I just couldn't really get it to work. Like, the text itself just didn't lend itself to doing a comparative structure. So there's quite a number of different ones. There's lots of them I haven't tried. There's one called Paradox Maintained. I haven't even bothered to try that one, but yeah, there's a bunch of them. So I don't know that there's one that I don't like, but there's a bunch I haven't tried.
Let's talk about some specific sermons. I know this episode we're not really focusing too heavily on like the last sermon on Sunday, but we also didn't have any episodes on those, not just last Sunday, but the Sunday before. And I wanted to give you a chance. Is there anything you'd like to highlight from those sermons that you maybe liked or just wanted people to really get out of your preaching in those?
I don't think. I don't think there was anything earth-shattering about the two sermons, but I did. I liked the first one. I think the best of the two of them. I think it was just a good Lutheran sermon. Ladders to Nowhere. It was. I had been teaching these classes on the different religions, and the one thing that was quite noticeable about all of them is that they all make ladders to God, and so and Lutheranism is very much so against that, and and emphasize that. And a couple of people afterwards mentioned that hey, that was a good solid sermon, that it's something we need to hear every now and again to make sure that we don't fall off the track there. So I think that one was I actually kind of enjoyed that sermon. Once More Into the Breach, the one that I preached just last weekend, that sermon theme I borrowed from Dr. Penhaligon. He is a professor at seminary. I just kind of like the connection there, between Henry V and the text on Elijah. How you feel. It's easy to feel disillusioned, about our work, especially in our modern world where things tend to go awry. And then you look at Elijah and things are just.
It's not much different.
It's not much different. But there's still work to be done, and God sends us out there to do His work for Him. So,
out of all your sermons this past year, do you have a particular favorite?
I know the
you
one.
knew I was going to ask that.
I did. I know that the one that everybody remembers is the drill sergeant sermon. I don't think anybody even knows what the name of it is. They just call it the drill sergeant sermon.
Do you remember the name of it?
I did. I looked it up.
I was going to say, I think on yesterday you didn't remember the name.
No, I did not. So I looked it up when you asked me, and I said it's called The Dangerous War. And so this war that we fight here, the spiritual war, is a dangerous war. But that's actually not my favorite sermon. I actually, it was one of the first sermons I preached. It's called The Power of Prayer on James 5. I think I really liked that sermon. It was a problem solution structure, and then I think it did a pretty good job of laying out the problem. How we pray for things, and sometimes we just don't get those things. And then I worked through that whole thing, and ended with Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he was praying for the Father to take this away if it was His will. And
I remember that sermon.
yeah, and I think that's my favorite sermon.
Do you remember if we did a podcast episode on that?
Oh, wait, no, that was back in September.
That was September you did that. Wow. Yeah. Then no, we definitely did not have one on that. Very good. So any others you wanted to talk about?
I mean, I did like the drill sergeant, the one. I think that one was a fun one to preach, I think. I enjoyed that sermon. In fact, another one I liked, I can't remember the name of it, but it was my apologetics sermon, the one where with the different theories on how what happened to Christ's body. That one I enjoyed preaching too.
So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about probably your favorite part of the process, memorizing. So what was that like this past year?
Oh boy, that was terrifying at first. I remember. I think it was our second conversation that we had. I called the day I was notified that I was going to be. The day we got assigned to St. John, and we talked to Pastor, but he didn't mention anything about memorizing sermons. And of course, just like you guys, tried to Google me and social media me and all that, I tried to find out everything I could about St. John, and there was no video, so I really had no idea.
That's true. You wouldn't know.
Yeah, I had no idea what was going on, and so anyway, so I think in our second conversation, Pastor mentioned to me that there's going to be a requirement to memorize sermons, and I was like,
terrified.
It was terrified, right? And then so over the summer, I preached once at our home congregation, and I made an effort to memorize the sermon, and I did, but it took me like 3 days to memorize the sermon. I was like, oh my goodness, this is going to be brutal.
How am I going to get anything else done?
Oh yeah, exactly. How am I going to get anything else done? And so when I first started here, that was the expectation, and I think it still took about 2 or 3 days to memorize a sermon. So,
but towards the end, it took you a lot less time, right?
Yeah. Now I'm down to about an hour a page. So it's taught me a couple of things. One, to write shorter sermons. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, that's another thing I struggle with, is I tend to not be as concise as I should be. But so my sermons tend to be a little bit longer, and so it takes longer to memorize them. But yeah, now I'm about an hour a page, so I can usually memorize in about 5 hours or 6 hours or so. So yeah, so it doesn't take me quite as long. So yeah, that was a little bit. It was a little bit of a challenge at the beginning, but I do see the benefit of it. It's a lot easier to put the emotion in, the nuance in, the inflection in, if you have the sermon memorized. You
can look at the people too, right?
Yeah, and your head's not constantly bobbing up and down. Looking at your notes or whatever.
I wonder how easy it is to make the manuscript a crutch as well. So I don't know, when you memorize it, I mean, you don't have anything in front of you. You just have your memory.
That's it.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I always, I use the manuscript. I mean, I don't know what you mean by a crutch exactly, but I always have my manuscript up there just in case I forget, because, I wouldn't want to, completely lose my place and then not be able to find it again, even with the manuscript. So I always have it up there.
So then you still had it.
Yeah. I just don't use it, but it's there. It's funny. As a professor at the seminary in the homiletics class, he told us a story that it was going to stick with me forever. But he said he had his sermon memorized, and he was at a congregation that had to it was 3 services, and so. During the first 2 services, he had his manuscript in front of him, and he just knew when to turn the pages because he knew where he's at. He just knew, right? And so the third time he preached, he didn't move the pages, because he just was like, I got this, and then he forgot his place, and then he spent 15 seconds trying to find his place in his sermon. So
too much confidence is not always a good thing.
But yeah, no, it's really good to have your sermon memorized. I think it definitely adds to the delivery.
And then I guess throughout the year too, there probably came a point where it was no longer as nerve-wracking and terrifying to do.
No, but I still pray that I won't forget anything. That's what I'm doing right before I go up there, usually during the hymn of the day. Please let me remember this. So yeah. But it's not as challenging as it was, and if you know your sermon and you know generally what it is you're going to say, even if you can't remember the exact words, you can usually phrase it the way you're planning on it. So.
Okay, well, my last question for you is, do you have a favorite part of the process for writing a sermon?
Yeah, I actually think that my favorite part of the process is doing the research, reading all of the different commentaries, the different resources out there, and just and seeing the different ways that people have preached the different texts, and seeing how best to put that into place. You get a lot of different perspective. I try to go to a couple of different sources for certain. The Concordia commentaries, Luther's preaching on the text is always good. There's a website out there called The Craft of Preaching that has a lot of good resources. So I think that's my favorite part, is actually just kind of looking through the text. And actually another favorite part is translating the text, because it's interesting sometimes, not always or even necessarily usually, but there's sometimes that there's different nuances in the text that don't come out very well in the English, and so it's interesting to see those different nuances as they come out. So I kind of like that. I think only once this year I've actually used Greek in a sermon to point something out. And interestingly, I can't remember exactly what it was, but somebody came up to me and said, thanks for explaining what the Greek was, what that meant. So yeah, it's not something that happens all the time, but it's really interesting when it does.
Well, thank you, Vicar, for today's discussion about your sermons, and just for this past year of preaching the word to us. We actually have one more episode with Vicar James we're actually re-recording right after this one.
Yep,
so it's going to come out a little later. But this is a farewell episode where we're just going to kind of have fun. It's going to be me and Pastor Adam will be in the episode with Vicar, and just going to ask him some questions about this next year at the seminary, and just he's getting closer and closer, less than a year to become a pastor. Yeah. So it'd be fun to talk about. Mm-hmm. And also just with National Youth Gatherings coming up soon, so there's going to be some different summer scheduling with our podcast episodes. So just to give you guys a heads up on that. The links to both of Vicar's last two sermons will be in the show notes. And if you would like to listen to those sermons, you could also go to stjohndublin.org. And then if you, the listener, would like to submit any question, please feel free to email us at podcast@stjohndublin.org. We always appreciate questions, especially from our confirmation students. That's always cool when we get those on the sermon notes.
Yeah, they're usually some of the most insightful too.
They usually are. Yeah, definitely. So thank you again for feeding us the word, not just this past week, but this whole year of your vicarage.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure.
All right. Bye.